The cockpit was silent, but it wasn't peace. It was a storm about to break. Two pilots, two hands on the same controls, two men who refused to let go. The engines roared, the runway waited, and in the next breath, one of them would betray the other. If you're ready to witness a story of struggle, heartbreak, and transformation, hit that subscribe button now, because what happens next will leave you breathless. The engines roared in his memory, long before he ever sat inside a cockpit. Darius Cole grew up in a place where dreams felt too heavy to lift, in a weather-beaten house on the edges of Mississippi. The roof leaked when it rained, the walls groaned in the wind, and the cold in winter crept into his bones. His father was gone before he ever spoke his first word, leaving only a name and an empty chair at the table. His mother, Maria Cole, became the center of his universe, a woman who worked until her hands blistered, who dragged herself home from double shifts with exhaustion in her eyes, yet hope in her voice. "Baby," she would whisper, pulling him close, even when her arms shook from fatigue. "Donna Stead, let this world tell you what you can stead be. The sky, Donna Stead, care about the color of your skin. The clouds, Donna Stead, ask where you came from. If you want it bad enough, the sky will take you." And Darius, just a boy with second-hand shoes and wide eyes, believed her. When other kids played football in dusty lots, he lay on his back in the grass, tracing the contrails of passing jets with his finger. He would whisper to himself, "One day that sepp'll be me. One day I sepp'll fly." Life didn't give him chances, so he carved them out with his own hands. At 14 he scrubbed cars, his school uniform ruined by grease and oil. At 16 he flipped burgers in a hot kitchen, slipping crumpled bills into a jar at night. On the jar, written in shaky handwriting, were two words: flight school. Every shift was a sacrifice. Every dollar was a step closer. But dreams often demand a cruel price. His mother's health began to fade, her body giving out under the weight of years of labor. He would hear her coughs at night, muffled behind a thin wall, and his heart would ache because he couldn't fix her, couldn't ease her pain. One evening, as she sat on the edge of her bed, she gripped his hand tightly. "One day, Darius," she whispered, her voice fragile but steady, "you stead in that cockpit. Promise me, you won't stead give up. No matter what they say, no matter who tries to stop you." Tears burned in his eyes as he nodded. "I promise, Mama." But promises can't stop time. That summer, her heart gave out in the quiet hours of the night. He found himself alone, staring at the jar of money she had once encouraged him to fill, his grief pressing against him like a storm he couldn't escape. Yet he remembered her words, "Don't give up." At 20, with the jar finally full, he climbed into a small Cessna for his first flying lesson. His hands trembled as the wheels lifted off the ground, the earth shrinking beneath him. For a moment, his chest ached with both sorrow and triumph. He whispered to himself, "This is where I belong." Whispered to himself, "This is where I belong." But belonging did not mean acceptance. In aviation school, Darius was one of the few black students. Whispers followed him in the halls. Instructors doubted him before he even touched the controls. One looked him in the eye after a lesson and said, dryly, "Cole, you've got potential, but airlines don't exactly roll out the red carpet for guys like you." The words cut deep, but instead of breaking him, they hardened him. He studied when others partied, trained while others slept. Nights were long, days were longer, but he carried his mother's voice in his mind, pushing him forward. When the time finally came, he held the license in his hands, proof that the impossible was now real. He had become a commercial pilot. Yet in every story of rise, there is an enemy waiting. His came in the form of Richard Hayes. Richard had the confidence of someone who had never known hunger, never known loss. Son of an Air Force colonel, raised with doors already open, Richard moved through the academy as though the world belonged to him. His uniform was always crisp, his smile calculated, his arrogance effortless. During training, Richard smirked as Darius finished a flawless simulation. "Cole, passion farns cute, but passion doesn't fly planes. Discipline does. Experience does. And let's steps be honest. You still always be a few steps behind." Darius met his eyes, steady, and unflinching. Experience comes with time. Respect should come automatically. Respect. It was the one thing Richard never gave him. No matter how hard Darius worked, no matter how many hours he put in. And fate, in its cruel way, doesn't care about rivalries. It doesn't care about past scars. It simply places people together and waits for the explosion. That explosion would come on Flight 317, Atlanta to New York. Passengers filled the cabin with their small lives. A mother rocking her baby to sleep. Businessmen glued to their laptops. Lovers whispering promises. None of them knew the truth. That behind the cockpit door sat two men who despised each other. Two men whose history was soaked in struggle and privilege, sacrifice and arrogance. The engines hummed. The runway stretched ahead. And in the sealed room of glass and metal, Darius Cole and Richard Hayes prepared to fly together. But long before the wheels left the ground, the war had already begun. The sky that Darius loved so much would soon turn into the stage of his greatest heartbreak. Flight 317 was supposed to be routine. Atlanta to New York, 2 hours in the air. Nothing unusual. Passengers settled into their seats. Attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, and the hum of engines promised safety. But inside the cockpit, tension was already thick enough to strangle. Richard slid into the captain's seat with an air of entitlement, his movements sharp, almost dismissive. Darius took the co-pilot's chair, his jaw set, his eyes steady. They exchanged no greeting, only the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. Richard broke it first. "I'll handle takeoff," he said coldly, his hand already reaching for the throttle. Darius didn't flinch. "It's my rotation. You know the schedule." Richard's lips curled into a half smile, mocking. "Schedules bend. Tradition doesn't stick. I lead, you follow. That's how it works." The words struck like blades. But Darius refused to yield. He gripped the edge of his seat, steadying his breath. "This isn't set about tradition. It's sets about respect." Richard leaned closer, his voice a low hiss. "Respect isn't set given. It's sets earned. And let sets be clear. Cole, you still never earn mine." The silence after was deafening, broken only by the steady whir of instruments. Passengers laughed somewhere beyond the door, oblivious to the storm building at the front of the plane. Darius' thoughts burned. He remembered the long nights, the sacrifices. His mother's voice urging him not to give up. Was all of it meant to bring him here, only to be humiliated in the very place he had fought so hard to reach? His fists tightened, not in anger, but in grief. The first betrayal came in small ways. Richard ignored his input on checklists, skipped over his calls, and dismissed his corrections with sharp flicks of his hand. Every procedure that demanded teamwork turned into a silent tug-of-war. Darius held his ground, but each slight was another wound. Then came the blow that cut deeper than all the rest. During a pre-flight review, an attendant stepped into the cockpit with a question about passenger seating. Richard, without hesitation, turned to her and said, "Don't state worry about him. He stakes just here to observe. I stake the one flying this bird." The words hit like a hammer. Darius stared at him, his chest tight, his pride shattered. In front of another crew member, Richard had stripped him of his authority, reduced him to nothing. The attendant hesitated, her eyes flicking between the two men. She offered a nervous smile and slipped out, leaving behind a silence that throbbed with humiliation. Darius's voice trembled, not with fear, but with rage held tightly inside. "You crossed a line." Richard leaned back in his seat, satisfied. "You you're lucky to be here at all. Don't forget that. Men like me open the doors. Men like you are allowed in, if you stay quiet." The cockpit seemed smaller then, suffocating, the air heavy with betrayal. Darius turned away, staring out at the runway lights glittering in the distance. He thought of his mother, of her fragile voice saying, "Promise me you won't give up." But tonight, giving up felt dangerously close. The betrayal deepened as the flight moved forward, at cruising altitude. Richard deliberately altered commands, pushing the aircraft into maneuvers that unsettled even the attendants. Darius corrected silently, his hand steady. But Richard's smirk grew each time. It wasn't about flying anymore. It was about dominance. And then came the moment of heartbreak that would scar Darius forever. Over the intercom, Richard Tepp's voice rang clear, calculated, and cruel. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard. We still have a smooth flight today. I am joined by my observer, First Officer Cole." Observer. The word twisted like a knife. Darius's throat burned. His dream had been reduced to a mockery in front of hundreds of passengers. He wasn't a pilot in Richard's eyes, wasn't an equal, wasn't even a man worth acknowledgement. He sat there, silent, his eyes locked on the endless sky outside. His heart screamed, but no sound left his lips, because in that moment, the betrayal was complete, and the war was no longer about flight. It was about dignity. And dignity was something Darius swore he would fight for, even if it meant tearing the sky itself apart. The night after flight, 317, felt endless for Darius. He sat alone in his small apartment, the glow of the city leaking through the blinds, but offering no comfort. His uniform lay crumpled on the chair, not with pride, but with shame. Every word Richard had spat, every public insult, every stolen ounce of dignity replayed in his mind, until it was unbearable. Observer. That single word echoed like thunder. His hands clenched until his knuckles whitened. His chest ached as though the betrayal had carved something out of him and left only emptiness behind. He thought of his mother's promise, the one she had begged from him on her deathbed. Don't give up. But how could he keep fighting when the very system he bled for treated him as if he didn't belong? He whispered into the silence, his voice breaking, "Mama, I don't know if I can keep this promise." But grief often hardens into resolve. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The boy who had once stared at contrails in the sky, whispering dreams to the clouds, rose again inside him. He would not be erased. He would not be silenced. If respect wasn't given, he would command it with excellence, so undeniable, so unshakable, that even Richard Hayes would be forced to see him. The transformation began quietly. Darius rebuilt himself in discipline and fire. While others slept, he pored over manuals, memorizing every system, every detail of aircraft mechanics. While others relaxed after flights, he stayed in simulators until his muscles knew the controls better than his own heartbeat. His body grew leaner, his eyes sharper, his confidence no longer borrowed from his mother's faith, but forged from his own relentless work. He stopped waiting for Richard's acknowledgement. He stopped bending under the weight of dismissal. Slowly, other crew members began to notice. Attendants whispered about his calm in turbulence, his precision during difficult landings, his quiet authority that filled the cockpit even when Richard tried to overshadow him. One evening, after a grueling storm-bound flight, a young flight attendant lingered near the cockpit door. "Officer Cole," she said softly, her eyes shining with something like admiration. "I just wanted to say, I've never felt safer on a plane than I did tonight. Thank you." The words pierced through him, not like Richard's daggers of scorn, but like light breaking through clouds. Respect was blooming, not demanded by arrogance, but earned through consistency, through sacrifice, through unshakable presence. Richard, however, noticed the shift. His arrogance began to curdle into resentment. Each time the crew gravitated toward Darius, each time passengers spoke his name with gratitude, Richard's control slipped a little further. His smirks grew tighter, his words sharper, and beneath it all burned the fear of something he had never known before: being overshadowed. The final spark came one night during training exercises. A simulated engine failure put the plane into a dangerous dive. Richard froze, panic flickering across his polished face. But Darius didn't hesitate. His hands moved with steady precision. His voice calm, commanding, certain. The simulator leveled. The crisis ended. And for one silent second, Richard's eyes betrayed the truth. He had been saved by the man he called Observer. That was the night Darius knew his transformation was complete. He was no longer the boy begging for respect. He was the man who carried it, the pilot who had earned it in sweat, pain, and fire. But transformation is never the end. It is only the beginning of the storm. And soon, karma would demand its price. Because on one fateful flight, in the very same cockpit where betrayal had been born, Darius and Richard would face each other again. This time, not with words, not with smirks, but with everything on the line. The sky had waited long enough. The reckoning was coming. The night of Flight 417 began like any other, but Darius felt the tension in his bones before the engines even roared to life. The sky outside was restless, thick clouds rolling like an army gathering in silence. Inside the cockpit, the air was heavier still. Richard sat in the captain's chair, smug as ever, but beneath the arrogance there was something brittle. Darius settled into his seat, hands steady on the controls. He no longer looked at Richard for validation. He didn't need it. He carried his mother's voice, the faith of passengers who had whispered their trust, and the steel forged through years of humiliation and relentless effort. Tonight, he was ready. The flight climbed into the storm. Rain lashed against the windows, lightning carved across the sky, and turbulence tossed the aircraft like a toy. At first, Richard barked commands with forced confidence, but soon the storm pushed harder, and cracks began to show. Then came the explosion. A sudden shudder, alarms screaming through the cockpit. Engine 2 was gone. The jet dropped. Passengers screamed. Oxygen masks fell. Panic wrapped around the plane like chains. Richard froze. His face drained of color. His hands hovered above the controls. Trembling, for the second time in his life, the sky demanded more of him than his arrogance could give. His voice broke. I can set. That was the moment Darius rose. His voice cut through the chaos, calm, sharp, commanding. Level the wings. Reduce thrust. Maintain control. His hands moved like instinct. Every hour in the simulator, every night of study, every insult that had fueled his transformation, leading to this exact second. He steadied the dive, stabilized the plane, and gave life back to every soul on board. The crew obeyed him, not Richard. Passengers prayed to him without knowing his name. In the storm's heart, it was Darius Cole who became the captain. Richard sat paralyzed, forced to watch as the man he once called observer became the savior. His arrogance shattered, his legacy crumbled in silence. By the time the wheels touched the runway in an emergency landing that would be studied for years, Richard Hayes was nothing but a shadow beside the man who had risen from his scorn. When the passengers stepped off the plane, many touched Darius's arm, whispered "thank you," and looked at him with eyes full of the respect he had once begged for. It wasn't handed to him. It was earned, carved from fire and storm. Richard never flew again. His name faded into gossip, a cautionary tale about pride. But Darius, his story soared. He became more than a pilot. He became a symbol of resilience, of dignity, of transformation. And sometimes, late at night, he would look at the stars beyond the runway, whispering softly to the memory of his mother. I kept my promise. The sky, once a place of betrayal, was now his kingdom.